Bay is traditionally the territory of the Numgees, and it was a winter village and also a burial grounds. When the settlers came, they established a cannery here sometime in, I think, the late 1800s. And so the community moved here from the mouth of the Nimkish River, which is on Vancouver Island. And the community's been here since. So there's the one main reserve is the Numgees Reserve, and there's also a smaller reserve known as the Wilalayu, and that's comprised of some different villages that were basically disbanded by the Department of Indian Affairs, and they were relocated here. When I was a child in the 1970s, this was a fairly wealthy community in terms of a lot of people were able to make a pretty good living fishing. There was also people involved in logging and mining, but fishing was the main industry here. And there was a lot of economic businesses here, like economic activity here in Alert Bay. So there was like 2 or 3 supermarkets, there was like 2 taxi companies, there was hotels, there was a theater, an arcade. I remember a lot of youth, when they turned 16, they would be given a new car by their parents. But through the 80s and into the 90s, with the massive decline in the fishing industry, mostly because of industrial overfishing and environmental impacts on spawning rivers and spawning grounds, so the fishing industry faced a massive decline. And so now there's not that type of wealth in the community. So now we have like one grocery store. There's not even really, there's no taxi fleet. There's like one woman who runs her own taxi vehicle. And a lot of the hotels here have closed, the arcade's gone, there's no theater. And so there's been like a big economic decline in the community here. And it's also affected other communities here on the North Island, because like they all kind of relied on logging to a big extent, as well as fishing and mining. And all those industries have faced significant decline. So yeah, a lot of the communities here up in the North Island here have suffered that. And there's a lot more, I think there's a lot more impoverishment today, particularly within the Indigenous community. And of course now, because of COVID and this global economic decline and the rising food prices and whatnot, I mean, this impoverishment is like increasing, I would say. Well, I grew up, I spent a couple years in the Kwakwaka'wakw territory in a 100-mile house. And then I moved here. I lived in Fort Rupert, which is on northern Vancouver Island, and it's a Kwakwaka'wakw community, and that's where part of my family is from, the Kwakwaka'wakw, through the Hunts. And then we lived in Port Hardy, and then we moved to Alert Bay. And I actually moved around quite a lot because my mother lost her status when she married my father. So we couldn't get housing on reserve, and she couldn't get a lot of services or whatnot because she had lost her status. So we moved around a lot. I moved down to Campbell River and then down to the Lower Mainland, Surrey, White Rock, and then into Vancouver, East Vancouver. Yeah, so that was my childhood. I moved around a lot, lived in a lot of different kind of housing situations and stuff like that. Yeah, and that's basically it. While I was living in East Vancouver, I was actually in the military. I was in the Army Reserves. And a cousin of mine was into punk rock at the time in the mid-'80s. And I started getting exposed to punk music. And I started listening to our radio station in Vancouver that played a lot of punk. So I recorded over all my cassettes that I had, which wasn't that many, but I recorded over them with punk music. And just the more I listened to the music and the lyrics, and I was going to punk shows and that, it just kind of started to change my political views, which, maybe at the time I didn't feel like I really had political views, but they were probably quite right-wing because of my military background that I had, because I was in Army Cadets for 5 years and then I was in the Army Reserve. So anyway, that kind of challenged a lot of my worldviews and opened up my mind to different to just different ways of looking at the world and how people could organize themselves in a society. And so that introduced, through punk, I got into anarchism. And I became involved in the anarchist movement, which a lot of punks were involved in. And then just a lot of radicals from the 1970s period. And yeah, that was kind of my politicization, my radicalization. The first political group I joined was a solidarity group with El Salvador, which at the time in the mid 80s was undergoing like a massive civil war with a revolutionary movement conducting armed struggle against the state, which was being heavily funded by the United States government. And they were mostly a Marxist-Leninist organization. But as I got more involved in the anarchist movement, I kind of withdrew from that a little bit and focused more on just the anarchist movement. I think the big turning point for me was the Oka crisis of 1990, because just the resistance that was displayed by the people there and the warriors, it really inspired me. And I already had the militant background because I had the military thing going on. So the idea that they'd taken up arms and that it didn't like shock me or anything, because I was already comfortable with firearms and whatnot. So this armed resistance I found very inspiring. And that's when I really started to look into my own ancestry and the colonization of indigenous peoples. And in 1992 was the 500-year mark of the Columbus and the European invasion of the Americas. And so there was a lot of organizing going on around that at the time. So I wanted to know the history myself. So I did a lot of research and I wrote a very long article about the 500 years of indigenous resistance. And that was kind of like also a big turning point for me. So the Oka crisis of 1990 and then the 1992 centenary, I think it was called, of Columbus's invasion. Those two things really kind of set me on the path of devoting more of my time and energy to indigenous movements and indigenous struggles. And I kind of started to move away from the anarchist movement a little bit at that point, but not totally. So there was always a crossover. And so that was when my anti-colonial focus really began. They're very different cultures. Like the anarchist movement has a culture, and it is very different from indigenous cultures, which are also very diverse. And there's diversity in the anarchist movement as well. But one thing I found, and it's like anarchism helps us to kind of analyze and understand this society that we're living in now, that it colonized indigenous peoples, and to a certain extent we've been assimilated into it. So now we have to understand and confront this new political system, capitalism, and the state institution. And anarchism is a good way to analyze that and understand what type of system and society this is. So that's how I kind of approached it. I never had an idea of merging the two, like into an indigenous anarchism type of thing, because indigenous cultures, for the most part, are quite autonomous and based around self-organization already. And there's a kind of a strong, not so much opposition, but there's a kind of a deviation from having authoritarian, centralized controls in indigenous societies and in the communities. So I didn't really feel a big need that I need to like push this anarchism into indigenous communities. But I think there was a lot of tools in anarchism that do help us analyze and understand the system that has colonized us and that we're presently, having to live in. So that's how I kind of approached it. To my understanding, colonization, I mean, I came up with kind of like a definition and a process of it because when I was with the Native Youth Movement, we were doing a lot of workshops and trying to explain colonialism. It's it sounds like a really foreign idea, an alien concept, because we don't actually hear much about colonization or colonialism in our daily lives. And of course, we're not really taught about it in the educational system. except that it was a historical period in time when primarily the European nations went out and carried out this period of colonization. But to me, colonization is it's the invasion and occupation of other people's lands and territories for either for the purpose of resource exploitation and or settlement. And from what I gathered and from what I could understand, there's basically 4 stages of colonization. The first one is reconnaissance missions, which are often celebrated as voyages of discovery, like Columbus or Captain Cook. For example, there's small forces that are going out and conducting reconnaissance. They're mapping areas, they're doing surveys. If they encounter indigenous peoples, they're taking account of what is the population numbers like, what kind of weaponry do they have, what kind of shelters do they live in, all this type of intelligence information. It's like an intelligence gathering mission. And after that, the second stage of colonialism is the invasion, where they come back with a much larger force. So like when Columbus sailed into the Caribbean region, he had 3 ships, right? And then when he returned to Spain and he came back with a much larger force of like 18 ships and a couple thousand conquistadors and sailors and whatnot. So that's the second stage of the invasion. And once the invasion force lands and is able to establish a beachhead or take control of some territory, it usually sets up an occupation regime, like a local government, a local colonial governing system. And once that's established, and this process can take many, many years and even decades, depending on the terrain and whatnot and the opposition from the indigenous peoples. But once the occupation type of regime is established, then it usually enters into an assimilation phase. And so within Canada, for example, that would be the imposing of the Indian Act, the establishing of reserve systems, the band council system, and also the residential school system, which was a really important means of assimilation, because that's when indigenous people were taken and forced to learn European ways of life, like the English language in Canada, learning how to live as a European people. So that's basically what colonization is, in my understanding. And it's not just a European phenomenon either. It's something that you can trace back to ancient Egypt, which was doing the same type of colonization of neighboring tribes, and you find it anywhere that civilizations have been established, because once you have these urban centers established, which are based on agriculture, began with the agricultural revolution like 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. But once you have these urban centers established, they have to constantly expand and acquire new resources as they deplete the resources in their region. And so that just leads to colonization, because that's the taking of other people's land and territory and resources is, I think it's part of the historical process of civilization, of Western civilization, which we're kind of living under the domination of today. And so, that's my understanding of colonialism. Well, the Indian Act was, it was imposed by the federal government in 1876. And it was always meant to be a temporary legislation until it was felt that indigenous communities had been assimilated enough that the Indian Act could be done away with, and the special status for indigenous peoples and the special status for reserve lands and all these controls and regulations could all be done away with once the native peoples were assimilated. So that's kind of like it's a contradiction in many ways. Of course, because I think in 1969 or 1970, the Canadian government they introduced what's called a white paper, which is a proposal to do away with the Indian Act and the status and reserve lands and the band councils and stuff. And at the time, there was a massive opposition from not only grassroots indigenous peoples, but also like a lot of band councils were opposed to this, because it would, because the contradiction of it is with the reserve lands, it's like the last remaining lands that indigenous people have some form of control over. And because the traditional territories have all been taken, now it's private property or it's crown land. So we have these reserve lands which have a special legal status, and so they can't be bought and sold, right? Like normal private property. And so that was one of the big dangers of the Indian Act, was that it would transform reserve lands into basically fee simple property, which could be bought and sold. And so that was kind of withdrawn by the federal government because of this massive opposition that came up against it. And over the years, over the decades, the government has tried to introduce different types of legislation or policies that would basically accomplish the same goal, which is today, is to turn the band councils into a municipal form of government. Reserve lands would be transformed into fee simple property, which could be bought and sold or leased or whatever, just like any other property. And in British Columbia, one of the things that we've faced since the early 1990s, after the ochre crisis, one of the things the BC government did was introduce the BC treaty process, which is described as like a modern day treaty process. And it has all those goals within it, right? To take away the reserve land, to basically remove bans from the Indian Act. And some bands have done this, like the Nisga'a is probably the most well-known, but there's also been a handful of others. But a lot of bands are kind of opposed to it, but it's also been bogged down in this really bureaucratic process. It's taken many, many years of negotiations and millions of dollars in funding and whatnot. But there's still a lot of opposition to this idea that reserve lands would be removed and that Native people would lose their status. So I think that's kind of like the contradiction around the Indian Act. And today you have, a lot of business and government ministers in that, and even a lot of Indian Act band counselors talk about doing away with the Indian Act because it's an obstacle to greater economic development. Because if reserve lands could be opened up, they could lease them and they could do a lot more, they could sell reserve lands, or they could lease it to corporations and whatnot. So it is a contradiction. I think basically I think it would be more logical to resist the removal of the Indian Act if there's not in place a method by which Indigenous communities would acquire a land that they're presently living on, the land base, that they would maintain it as like a collective communal interest. Because if that's done away with, and eventually we could become homeless in our own homelands because we would have no land base. And the special status that Indigenous peoples have, it helps Indigenous people because we have, on reserve, we're exempt from paying taxes. We have more medical and dental coverage, for example. And if those kind of things were removed from the communities, I think it would just lead to more economic impoverishment and more problems for Indigenous peoples in their daily lives and their daily struggles. So I think that's the contradiction of the Indian Act. I mean, at one point, everybody in the world lived as Indigenous peoples, even European peoples. They lived as tribal groups, right? The Celts, the Goths, and all that. It was the Roman Empire, Western civilization. It was the Roman Empire that colonized the tribes of Western Europe and imposed Christianity and the state institution on them. And it also happened in other areas of the world where these civilizations had established themselves. But I think a world without colonization and assimilation would be a world of Indigenous tribal peoples living in their territories. I do consider myself a traditionalist because I believe that our traditional forms of self-organization, our traditional forms of social organization, and our cultures were very stable. They were pragmatic. They were balanced. So we didn't develop technologies that would enrich ourselves and destroy our environment. So I think they were very logical in terms of protecting our environment and sustaining our resources for future generations. So, Indigenous peoples lived here on the coast for at least 10,000 years, and much longer probably. The time immemorial is a term used, which is time out of mind. So indigenous peoples lived here for many, many thousands of years with very minimal impact on the environment, compared to what the European society, the impact it's had here on the Northwest coast, and it's only been colonized for maybe 150, maybe 200 years at the most, and the level of destruction that's occurred is almost mind-boggling if you actually think about it. How much forest has been destroyed, how much rivers have been polluted, how much the salmon have declined, like all these natural resources have declined. And this was like one of the last areas of the world to be really heavily colonized. And so I can just imagine what other parts of the world, what their situation is in terms of resource degradation and degradation and environmental destruction that's occurred. So, yeah. I think that's where social movements like the anarchists and the autonomous movements play an important role, or could play an important role, in terms of like how can communities self-organize themselves, non-indigenous, these settler communities, how can they self-organize themselves? And I think like one thing about the system we're living in, it's very illogical, because it's obviously illogical to contaminate your water and the natural environment that you rely on for sustenance and for life itself. So it's a very illogical, it's very self-destructive. So, I mean, we can see the socioeconomic decline that we're experiencing in the world right now. It just points to how illogical and self-destructive the system is. So at some point, communities, whether it's Montreal or, some small town in Saskatchewan, at some point they're going to have to self-organize themselves and start looking at how they can be more self-sufficient, because eventually the system that we've organized, this global system, is not going to be able to meet the needs of communities. And we can see that right now with the decline in services that we're experiencing as a result of COVID, I think primarily in the last couple of years. So like medical services are all declining because health workers are being burned out and they're being overloaded with, patients right now. Policing is declining. A lot of government services are declining. We're seeing like increase in the price of food because those resources are being affected by natural disasters, which are coming from climate change. So we have all these crises that are converging. And at some point, I think the society that we have here is gonna like self-destruct and break down, and you're basically gonna have a return to some kind of like tribalism and tribal societies, and you're gonna have to build self-sufficient communities in order to survive. So that's how I kind of look at the future, and I promote the idea of autonomous self-organization, survival, and resistance as well, because the resistance movements that we have today that act to protect land and water, for example, are very important, because we're going to need clean air, clean water, and clean land in order to sustain our communities into the future. Once we go past, whatever crises and decline and breakdown that we're going to experience, which I think is inevitable. I think we're in it now. Like, we're experiencing the decline now because of the convergence of these crises, climate change, COVID, the economic decline and whatnot. So we're in it now, and it's probably going to be a long, drawn-out process. And some areas are going to be more impacted than others at first, but I think it's going to become fairly widespread. And there's like different kind of social indicators you can just kind of glimpse of what's going on in society, the stress that people are experiencing. Like, if you look at the United States with the mass shooting phenomenon, I mean, I think that's really coming from the isolation, the dysfunction of the society, and in the case of the United States, their access to incredible amounts of firearms, which is all makes for a very bad mix, and such a divided, polarized society as well. So, yeah, I think, that's my. If you look at the history of colonialism in North America, firearms have always played a really important role. First, in terms of the ability of colonial forces to impose their will on indigenous peoples and take their territory and carry out massacres and whatnot. But also, it played a big role in anti-colonial resistance, because once indigenous peoples began to acquire firearms, because you had different competing European powers, especially on the East Coast to begin with, you had different competing colonial powers who were happy to arm some indigenous groups and form alliances with them to fight against their European rivals. So the French, for example, were very happy to form alliances with different indigenous tribal nations and arm them to fight against the British and their indigenous allies. And there began a massive arms trade in North America at that time, and it spread everywhere that colonial forces and settlers moved into. Whatever region it was, would begin an arms trade, and firearms became very important. Even in the fur trade, it became very important as a means of quickly acquiring furs to bring to the European, trading forts, in part to acquire more firearms and ammunition. And these were the most sought after, the most valued, the most important trade tlmes during this period was the firearms. And it enabled a lot of indigenous peoples to resist colonialism. And a really good example is the Tlingit here on the Northwest Coast. In the northern region, in southern Alaska and northern BC, the Tlingit were never really conquered by the Russians, for example, or the British, because they were always heavily armed. So firearms play an important role in colonialism and anti-colonial resistance. And today, Oka is a really good example of the importance of armed struggle in terms of defending territory. And I think that's, just looking at history, it's an important thing to consider. But also, if we look at the polarization that's occurring in society and the mobilization of right-wing and in particular far-right forces such as fascists and neo-Nazis, who are, an essential part of their politics is forming paramilitary organizations that are armed, and their politics are very clear about, they're genocidal. They openly talk about committing genocide and massacring people of color, gays and lesbians, anybody that doesn't fit their worldview. So there's a very real danger right now from the far right. And in the last few years, probably in the last 10 years, far right fanatics have been responsible for many of the mass shootings in the United States. And so it's a threat that exists right now. And I think it's important that communities have the capability to defend themselves against these types of threats. The indigenous resistance here began in the late 1700s with the arrival of early Spanish and British colonial forces, including Captain Cook and George Vancouver. And it was, the history of British Columbia is often portrayed as this almost like a mutually beneficial process of the fur trade, in which native traders were really skillful and were able to extract, better value and all this from the fur trade and whatnot. But in reality, it was also a very violent period, because a lot of the trade vessels that came here were heavily armed, kind of gunboats almost. And they came in and often imposed trade conditions and tried to exploit indigenous peoples and also just steal the furs that were brought in. So there were a lot of attacks on these trading vessels that came into the region. Dozens of these vessels were attacked and destroyed. And that's often really downplayed in the history of British Columbia. Eventually in 1849 or so, when British Columbia became kind of like an official colony and the Hudson's Bay Company became the first kind of government of the colony, That's when you had Royal Navy gunboats were deployed here. And the Royal Navy gunboats played a really important role in terms of imposing colonial rule and expanding colonial control over the region. Because anytime there was an attack on settlers or a ship, these gunboats would be deployed, and they would demand from the village the suspects, who would often, if they were turned over, would often be hung in front of the village as an example to others not to engage in any types of resistance or attacks on colonial forces. And in other cases, they would destroy villages by naval bombardment or burning or sending Marines in to burn the village. So there was a lot of armed conflict throughout the 1800s, and this was mostly suppressed by the late 1800s. And then you entered into a period of kind of domination by the colonial power. And that's when the reservation system was imposed, the band councils with Indian agents overseeing all aspects of community activities. I look at it, like 1890, I kind of look at it as a period when Indigenous peoples no longer had the military capability of resisting. And that's I think, across North America. And that's the year of the massacre at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. And after that, you don't really have any more acts of resistance or armed struggle. And it's kind of like a really dark period, I think, where I think because of the depopulation from the disease epidemics and this imposing of colonial control and the Christianization that accompanied it, you didn't have a lot of resistance going on. Here in the Northwest Coast, there was a movement that arose around land claims, and a lot of communities and bands were angry at how small their reserve lands were, and how in many cases the reserve lands that they were provided with were being stolen by settlers, or the government would come in and appropriate sections of land, saying, okay, you've got too much, so we're going to take this and this, whatnot. And so there was a land claims movement that arose, which was eventually banned by the government in the 1920s. So they passed a provision to the Indian Act to outlaw land claims organizing or hiring of lawyers to pursue land claims. And this movement was very legalistic and bureaucratic in a sense. It was led by the band counselors, often in conjunction with priests as well, who had an interest in acquiring property on reserve lands with the church. So it was kind of like an odd movement in some ways. It was comprised largely of petitions to the government and petitions to the King of England. And you also had delegations that went to Fort Victoria or to Ottawa or even over to England to petition the powers that be to provide more reserve land or provide more funding to band councils and whatnot. There was also, among the Kwakwaka'wakw, there was also strong opposition to the ban on potlatching, which was a part of the Indian Act. So there was a lot of illegal, clandestine potlatching activity that continued on. And I think in 1920 or 1921, there was the police carried out a raid and they confiscated a lot of masks. And they eventually imprisoned a number of chiefs and other people who participated in some of these potlatches. They imprisoned them in Ocala, which was an old, decrepit prison located outside of Vancouver in the Lower Mainland. So that was during that period. You had the land claims and then the clandestine potlatching. And for the most part, until the 1950s, you didn't really have much real opposition occurring among Indigenous peoples in North America, I would say. And in the 1950s, of course, you had the Black Civil Rights struggle, which I think inspired a new generation of Indigenous resistance. New social movements were arising at the time, and this continued into the 1960s. And you had the emergence of Red Power and the American Indian movement, for example. The 1970 occupation of Alcatraz also created was a really important factor in spreading these ideas of red power and indigenous liberation and anti-colonial resistance. And that spread up into this community as well. So some of my family were involved in the Red Power movement at the time, and they participated in blockades in other parts of the province here. And when they came back to their community here, I think one of the significant things they did here was they started what's called the T School. Now it's a band-run school, but at the time it was an alternative school where they wanted to take children out of the government-run schools here and start to teach them more about their traditional culture and history and stuff like that. And that's kind of like typical, I think, of what happened in the 1970s, where you had this resurgence of resistance movements and whatnot. And indigenous people who were involved in those movements eventually went back to their communities, and they made different types of contributions as grassroots organizers to their community. Currently, the main, I think the main opposition movement you see happening here has been mostly against fish farms, which are very destructive to the wild salmon populations and the environment. So that's been the main kind of movement here. And again, it's also, it's been fairly legalistic, and it's been led by band counselors or people who really want to pursue the legalistic path. And so like petitions to the government or court challenges against fish farms. So that's kind of the main activity up here. There's a number of bands that are involved in the fish farm industry. So not all the bands up here are opposed to them, but I'd say that's probably been the most significant thing in this area. We wouldn't have referred to them as bands. I refer to them as villages because that's basically how we were organized into separate autonomous villages. And like I mentioned, I think there was like 29 or 30 separate village units basically that were comprised of family groups, which in other nations you might call clans, but we don't use that terminology. But they're basically family groups that comprised a village, and the village was an autonomous political unit. It could engage in trade or warfare at its own discretion. But all these village groups were unified by a common language and a common shared territory. So the territories of these village groups would overlap to some degree with the next village group. So we all shared a common language and a common culture. And that group is known as the Kwakwaka'wakw, which means the Kwakwala speaking people. So all those villages spoke Kwakwala and shared a common culture. Then with colonization, you had the Indian Act imposed. And so these communities, like this community here, the Numgis, were organized as a band. And each member was given a band membership. But under the Indian Act, you can apply to become a member of another band. So when my mother regained her Indian status, she eventually applied to the Numgis band because that's where most of our immediate family lived. Like all my aunts and uncles and a lot of my cousins live here. And so she applied to become a Numgis band member. And when I applied to get my status, the Department of Indian Affairs, also now it's known as Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, INAC, I think, they gave me the Numgis band membership and a Numgis band member number. And so that's why I'm a member of the Numgis First Nation, although I am not Numgis traditionally. I think a warrior is a person who sees it as their responsibility to defend their people and their community, their territory. At the most basic definition, a warrior is someone who trains and participates in war. In the absence of actual combat, like we're not engaged in armed combat here in Canada, but we certainly have the need to defend our people and communities and the territories. And so I think today, a lot of warriors are engaged in these kind of frontline actions to defend land and territory through blockades or other forms of direct action. We do have examples, modern day examples of warrior societies in North America who engage in armed resistance. And that, I think, it's an important aspect of looking at what is a warrior. A warrior has to be prepared for conflict and have some understanding of strategy and tactics for managing conflict. And I think one of the challenges we face is actually spreading this idea of the warrior, because it's something that's through colonization was really erased from our traditional cultures. So a lot of our dances here among the Kwakwaka'wakw are warrior dances, and they come from warrior societies. But that's really been, it's not really expressed as such. They're looked at as like dance societies. So I think there's a need to revive this warrior culture that is a part of our indigenous cultures overall. And understanding the history of resistance, I think, is an important part of the modern day warrior movement, because that's how we can find inspiration, but also many lessons to be learned from past movements and past forms of resistance. So I think, I think there's an important place for a warrior today. And as communities face the need to become more self-sufficient and more self-organized, I think this idea of warriors, of having some kind of security force, some kind of self-defense formations, will become more important. I think Louis Hall, who was a Mohawk writer and philosopher, he wrote the Warrior's Handbook, and one of his main points was like, there's a need to promote this warrior culture and warrior spirit, because without a fighting spirit, the people lack a will to resist. So the idea of the warrior is a very important part of resistance movements, especially indigenous resistance movements. And that was like what was really important about Oka in 1990, was that it helped to revive the warrior culture, the fighting spirit of indigenous peoples. And so it set the tone for indigenous resistance all through the 1990s and even up until today. And that's how important that standoff was for indigenous peoples, especially in Canada. Art plays a really important role in terms of communicating ideas, symbolizing ideas. And I think that's like a really important contribution of art, is that it can take even complex or abstract ideas and synthesize them into a graphic image that communicates or talks to an individual and relays this idea to them in a very simple, easily accessible format. So that's an important role I think art has played in social movements. It can serve as a rallying point to unify a movement. They can rally around a symbol, for example, with the anarchists, a black flag, which is the negation of national flags, but it's a symbol, it's a part of the culture of the anarchist movement. With indigenous resistance movements today, it might be the warrior unity flag that was developed by Louis Hall. So that's an important symbol to unify people. And when you see these symbols and you have an understanding of it, then you know that you might see a comrade or a brother or a sister that you share some affinity with. And traditionally, art has always played a really important role in indigenous cultures, and particularly here on the Northwest Coast, because of the red cedar tree, which we did a lot of carving, masks and painting of plaques and the big houses and stuff like that. So art was always a really important means of communicating these ideas among our people, including our ancestors. Like acknowledging and remembering our ancestral lineage through these masks and totem poles and house fronts and stuff like that. So it's an important means of, here in the culture, it's an important means of retaining our history and our ancestral lineage and our identity. And through that, it becomes into a larger thing of how we define our territories, and all types of things come from that. So art plays a really, really important role in our traditional culture as well. If I do my traditional art, it has a much more resonance, and it's from the traditional culture, which arises from this environment, because the culture really arises from the land and the terrain and the actual environment in which the people live. So our culture is very unique because the land we live in is very unique. And the same could be said of any other indigenous culture, like the Innu. Their culture is very unique. Their landscape that they live in is very unique. So when I do my traditional artwork, I mean, it comes from my ancestors, and they were influenced by the environment that they live in. So and even like a lot of our spiritual beings that our ancestors encountered, like I think they're particular to this land. It's what our ancestors saw and experienced. And so when I engage in my traditional artwork, I think it comes from this land. And it's an expression of the spirit of this land. And it's an important part of decolonization, is engaging in traditional forms of art. And I mean, some people engage in like decolonization by learning the traditional language and stuff like that. But for a lot of us here, the art is how we engage in decolonization and remembering our ancestry. I think it was when I was in kindergarten, we would do paintings and whatnot. And so that's when I first started doing art. And I think I was encouraged by my teachers or the comments of people. I was encouraged to keep doing art. So I've always done art since I was a small child. When I became involved in social movements, I saw that it was one of the ways I could contribute to groups and mobilizations and whatnot was with my artwork. So I began to, my art was primarily done in black and white because that's how it was easily reproduced on Xerox machines and stuff like that. A lot of groups don't have much of a budget for that form of communication, so black and white graphics were the way to go. I also would design logos for different groups, and often those were in black and white as well. So that was kind of, for many years, I mostly did black and white drawings. And those were used for posters to advertise events or rallies, or printed as t-shirts, and also used on banners and stuff like that. So that was the main ways I use my art to contribute to movements and resistance. My first attempts at doing comics, I would self-publish them as small zines. So that was one thing I got into with the punk movement, was doing a lot of zines. And so this one is, so this is like part of my effort to promote warrior culture. So this one's called Warrior Comics. And it's just it's a number of short black and white comics. And some of these are just kind of made up. They're just kind of like silly kind of comics. It's all indigenous based, but just kind of silly comics. But this one, for example, the Wolf Warrior Society is based on a Cheyenne warrior society, and it tells the story of how this warrior society came to an individual who then organized this particular warrior society. And I think it was after this that I began looking at comics as an important means of maintaining our history, a history of resistance. And one thing I'd begun doing in the late 1990s was producing small 4 or 8 page comics on 8x11 photocopy paper. Because I was involved with the Native youth movement at the time, and even things like Oka, which had occurred in 1990, it seemed like we were already losing this history because you couldn't really find any history book. There wasn't too much internet at the time. There wasn't like any archives that a Native youth could turn to. So I started making these small comics, and I would use them when we went to conferences or even powwows and stuff. If we could get into an office that had a photocopy machine, I could reproduce these comics. And so that's something I started doing. And eventually over time, I had a collection of these comics. And then someone suggested that I should make like a 500 years history comic. So I kind of expanded on it, and I did some more chapters, beginning with Columbus in 1492. And after a while, a friend of mine had gotten a book published at Arsenal Pulp Press in Vancouver. And so he brought a copy down to them, and they were interested in publishing it. And so that's how this first comic, this first graphic novel came about. It was eventually published in 2010, I believe. And it is a collection of short black and white chapters. And it includes some of the original comics I had done while I was active with the Native youth movement, like the Oka Crisis, the chapter on Ipperwash, the chapter on Chipatan, or the Gustafson Lake Standoff. These were comics that I did as zines that I would duplicate and distribute at Native youth gatherings and whatnot. And so that's how this comic came about. The Antifa comic came about after the election of Donald Trump to the US presidency. Arsenal Pulp Press contacted me and asked me if I would be interested in doing a comic about the anti-fascist resistance movements. And because I'd been involved in some anti-racist and anti-fascist groups in the 1990s, I had some background knowledge about the subject, and I agreed to do it. So this was published, I believe, in 2018 or 2019. And it's basically a history of anti-fascist resistance beginning in Italy, where the first fascist groups were established with Mussolini. And the first anti-fascist resistance began. And it basically documents this history through Nazi Germany and into the post-World War II period up to the election of Donald Trump and the resurgence of these far-right fascist movements, and also the resurgence of anti-fascist resistance movements. And this one was the first graphic novel that I did that was in color. So the 500 Years comic was black and white, and it was the first graphic novel that Arsenal Pulp Press had published. And so over the time, they've published more by other authors. And so I was really happy to do this one in color. It got a bit wordy, like there's a lot of text in some of the text boxes. And that's because I was facing a really tight deadline. And I was also acquiring all this knowledge from all this research I was doing that I really wanted to include. Because one of the things I found doing these comics is, writing in general, is when you first begin the research, everything's new and everything seems really important to share. And it's only over time that when you have time, you can go back and reread and edit stuff and see like what stuff is like most important, and you can kind of get rid of some of the material. But I didn't really have that time with the Antifa comic, so it got a bit rushed, and so it's a bit text heavy in my opinion. And the latest comic I did is a revised and expanded version of the 500 Years comic, and this one's in full color as well. I had approached Arsenal Pulp Press about redoing the 500 Years comic because I felt like over the years my artwork had become a lot better, and I had much better access to historical resources, and I felt like the subject, 500 years of Indigenous resistance, I felt like I could do it much better. I could do that it deserved to be told in a better manner, a better format than it had been done. And so I'm quite pleased with Arsenal's production that they did on this. It's a larger format. I'm I'm more comfortable with the artwork that I've done and the research and the execution of the comic format. I feel a lot better about. So I feel like I did the history more justice that it deserved. I see myself just continuing to do artwork for social movements and resistance. I mean, there's also a commercial aspect to my art because I rely on it for making a living or earning a livelihood. So I still have to engage in doing commissions, which I mostly enjoy doing because they're often with comrades or friends or family. I don't design logos for banks or transnational corporations. So I always see my art as contributing to community movements. Yeah, it's my only form of income is through making art. So I feel pretty fortunate that way that I can create art because I, for the most part, enjoy it. Unless there's a deadline, which I don't enjoy as much, but it does motivate you to get the work done more quickly. I think the biggest obstacle for artists is often getting started on the piece. Trying to come up with the concept of how you're going to execute this art, and then just finding the time to do it because I have my daughter to raise and stuff like that, other things I need to take care of. But so art's a really important part of my life.